They told America that the Astors built their empire on elegance, vision, and flawless contracts. But what if one forgotten stretch of land in 1885 hides the deal that should have destroyed their name? What if the only reason you've never heard of it is because someone paid for your silence decades before you were born? In the autumn of 1885, while New York's newspapers praised the Astor family for financing progress and reshaping the skyline, a very different story was being written far from Fifth Avenue parlors. On the ledgers, it appears as nothing more than a rural property, a farm quietly transferred along the path of an expanding railroad line. But if you follow the dates, the signatures, and the gaps, you begin to feel it. The tension of a Gilded Age where land wasn't just dirt, but leverage, blackmail, and currency in a private war between magnates. You're not entering a ballroom tonight. You're stepping onto a contested strip of earth that never reached the headlines. The party. Surviving records look clean at first glance. Purchase agreements, survey maps, modest valuations. Then the contradictions start to surface. A missing page in a county deed book. A witness who should have signed, but whose name never appears again in any Astor-related document. A sudden reclassification of the land just weeks before the railroad announces a route adjustment that multiplies its value. Newspapers of the time reported triumph and progress, but in private correspondence you find phrases like irregular acquisition, local resistance, and press matters handled. That's where rumor seeps in between the lines of history. People in the area spoke of a landowner who refused to sell and later left town overnight. A clerk who hinted at forged signatures and was abruptly transferred. A stack of letters that, according to an internal note, were disposed of by fire to protect the family's long-term interests. Officially, nothing happened. Unofficially, the Astor name passed over this patch of earth like a shadow that never wanted to be photographed. When you look at the timing of the transfers, the sudden involvement of railroad attorneys, and the silence of major New York papers that usually feasted on scandal, you start to understand how power edited reality in the Gilded Age. Witnesses were reassigned, records were rewritten, and what couldn't be rewritten was quietly burned. Have you ever heard a story like this hidden inside a Gilded Age estate? If this case reminds you of another sealed room, a missing heir, or a deal that never made it into the official books, share it below. Your comment might be the missing line in someone else's archive. This channel exists to reveal what the elite have tried to erase. So leave your like if you want more stories pulled from the margins, and subscribe before this kind of evidence slips back into the dark. Because tonight, as we unfold the first shadow over the Astor farm in 1885, we're not just asking how the land changed hands. We're asking what had to disappear so that their empire could remain untouchable. If you step back from that disputed farm for a moment and trace the ink lines outward, you run straight into the heart of the Astor world, into a version of the Gilded Age where power moved not only through ballrooms and marble staircases, but through the invisible margins of ledgers. By 1885, the Astors were not merely landlords. They were a kind of quiet government of their own, with Fifth Avenue facades that looked like palaces and a network of lawyers, agents, and trustees who made sure the public saw only what belonged in the society columns. Inside those houses, the rules were different. Heirs were groomed like investments. Marriages negotiated like mergers and properties. Farms, warehouses, tenements, and country estates circulated through shells of companies that allowed the family to be both present and absent at the same time. A parcel of land could be owned by them, controlled by them, and yet never carry their name in any public record that a reporter could easily trace. That is where the farm in our story becomes more than a rural footnote. It becomes a test case for how far a family like this would go to keep its Golden Age secrets intact. In family minutes that survive, the language is cool and practical. Reallocation of assets, harmonization of holdings, convenience of title. But when you look at who sat around those tables, elder Astors worried and about succession, younger relatives eager to secure their own slice of the fortune. advisors whispering about railroad opportunities, you begin to sense the pressure building behind the polished etiquette. A single misstep, a scandal in the wrong newspaper, and the reputation that justified their power could crack. So the land could not simply be sold, it had to be transformed, disguised, filtered through a series of signatures that made it appear as a neutral transaction in some county office, far from Fifth Avenue. That is where the silent witnesses enter the story. The clerk who processed the deed and later told a friend that the buyer did not match the price. The surveyor who drew boundary lines that conveniently matched future track expansions. The cousin whose name appears once in an internal memorandum as useful for rural matters, and then vanishes from the archive. None of them ever gave an interview. None of them ever appeared in the official histories of the Astor dynasty. Their traces are fragments in an increasingly thin file, like voices fading down a long corridor. At the surface, this is simply how a Gilded Age family protected its legacy, by using properties as bargaining chips in conversations with railroad barons and city officials who needed land to move steel and passengers. But if you connect dates and patterns, you see something more deliberate. A farm that had been in the same hands for decades suddenly becomes the subject of intense internal correspondence. A trust is created that exists for only a short span of years, just long enough to receive the land and then pass it along to an entity linked to the railroad. The newspapers report the triumph of progress, yet their silence about the human cost. The owner who resisted, the community that suspected coercion, feels almost rehearsed. This is what dark legacy looks like when it's still in motion, not yet ossified into myth. Decisions made in back rooms where curtains are drawn. Letters signed with a steady hand and later consigned to the fire, and a family name that must remain luminous in public, even as it casts a long shadow over those who stand in its way. Families like the Astors understood that archives could be both a weapon and a liability. They kept meticulous records of rents, interest, and inheritance, yet allowed certain categories of documents to be handled off-book. A draft letter protesting the sale of the farm survives only as a paraphrase in the margin of a legal note. A more detailed complaint mentioned in a trustee's journal is said to have been filed, then withdrawn by agreement, with no further explanation. You can almost see the hand that opened a drawer one evening, reread a letter too dangerous to preserve, and chose the match instead of the file label. The result is an arrangement that looks clean enough to pass scrutiny, but wrong enough to trouble anyone who pays attention to timing, relationships, and the way power tended to flow in one direction during the Gilded Age. And this leads to the question you can't quite escape. If you were standing in the family archive room today, with the key in your hand, would you have the courage to pull out the box marked for destruction, to access a file like this, knowing whose reputation it might shatter? Beyond the golden halls exists precisely in that uncomfortable space, among hidden heirs, forbidden rooms, silent witnesses, erased records, and the thin paper trail of agreements that were never meant to be read aloud. As you listen, remember that what we are piecing together here comes from the edges of the official story. The missing receipts, the altered entries, the annotations a tired clerk forgot to erase. The more you look, the clearer the pattern becomes. The farm was not merely sold, it was sacrificed, a piece offered on the board to buy influence with the railroad and secure generational power for a family that could not afford to lose ground. Yet, something still resists closure. In one surviving inventory, there is a reference to miscellaneous rural correspondence that should have been attached to the trust but is nowhere to be found. In a later blueprint of Astor Holdings, the farm is represented only as a faint rectangle, with a note suggesting the details are covered under separate documentation. And in a box misfiled under an almost unrelated estate, there is a single brittle page from a ledger, where 2 lines of ownership have been carefully ruled out in dark ink, leaving one name half-legible beneath the crossing, a name that does not match any official version of events, and that seems to wait, stubborn and incomplete, in the quiet heaviness of the paper. If you follow that half-legible name on the ledger page out of the archive room and back into the landscape, you can almost watch the land itself begin to move. On paper, the farm is a fixed rectangle, acres measured, boundaries described in careful ink. But in the late 19th century Gilded Age, land along a projected rail line was never really still. It shifted in value with every rumor of a new station, every whispered map unrolled on polished tables in New York boardrooms, every discreet carriage that stopped after dark at the back entrance of a law office rather than the front. The Astors understood this dance better than anyone. Their agents didn't talk about meadows and fences. They spoke in terms of corridor rights, through lines, anticipated traffic. What the county clerk saw under gaslight in a cramped office was a deed transferring a farm from one private owner to another. What the railroad directors saw under chandeliers in a walnut-paneled room was leverage, a stretch of earth that could tilt negotiations with the government and competitors, provided it never looked directly connected to a name as public as Astor. You can picture the first meeting if you listen closely enough. Chairs scrape lightly against parquet as men take their places around a long table, the low hiss of gas lamps casting pale circles over stacks of documents. A map is unrolled with a soft crackle, weighed down at the corners by crystal inkwells. Fingers trace a proposed route in the air above the paper. Tiny, rehearsed gestures that never quite touch the ink. Someone clears his throat just before mentioning the farm, as if the word itself needs to be handled carefully. The agreement, as drafted, will not say that the Astor family is ceding control of strategic land to a railroad firm in exchange for favors. It will speak, instead of a consortium of interested parties, of options purchased by a holding company whose name is bland enough to be forgotten by the next issue of the financial pages. The government, at least on paper, is supposed to be the ultimate buyer for expanded infrastructure. Yet by the time the official route is announced, the best pieces of land along it already sit in the quiet grip of entities tied back, in increasingly faint lines, to Fifth Avenue drawing rooms. In the countryside, the shift announces itself differently. A farmhand notices new survey stakes driven into the ground at odd angles, their fresh wood pale against the soil. A group of men arrive at dawn, talking in low voices as they pace out distances with chains and notebooks, ignoring questions from the family who still thinks of the field as theirs. On market day, someone says the land is as good as gone, though no one can quite say when the decision was made. The original owner's last appearance in the record is a signed transfer that leaves just enough ambiguity to make any later protest look like regret instead of coercion. By the time the first rails are unloaded from flat cars and stacked like a promise along the road, the farm's name is gone from the ledgers that matter. In its place, there is a reference to rural property for development and a note in the margin about timely cooperation from private interests. From the vantage point of beyond the golden halls, this is where the Golden Age secrets start to glow faintly at the edges. Families like the Astors didn't simply partner with railroads. They learned to use them as extensions of their own reach. A stretch of track could increase the value of nearby estates, open new markets for city properties, and perhaps most importantly, deepen the family's informal influence with officials who needed the appearance of private goodwill. In private correspondence, you find phrases like preferential siding access, consideration to be reflected at a later date, and press matters to be harmonized. Those phrases live in files that were never meant for public archives, files that sometimes survive only because a junior clerk misfiled a folder or a box was forgotten in the wrong wing of a building. They reveal a pattern: land meant to be offered to the government first is routed instead through intermediaries, with profits and favors flowing back to the same limited circle of names. The encobramento, the cover-up, is almost more delicate than the transaction itself. Newspaper editors reliant on advertising from railroad companies and Astor-owned properties learn to focus on the spectacle of progress: gleaming engines, proud speeches, ribbon-cutting ceremonies. When local rumors surface about families pressured to sell, about prices that don't quite match the land's new strategic value, they are smoothed over with a combination of silence and distraction. An editor receives an invitation to a society event just as he considers assigning a reporter to the story. A columnist known for his sharp tongue starts writing, suddenly and enthusiastically, about charitable donations from the very families whose deals he might otherwise have questioned. In the background, an Astor trustee dictates a brief note to a secretary about aligning narratives, the pen pausing only a fraction of a second before committing the euphemism to paper. All of this leaves a peculiar imprint in the archives. In official government files, the farm appears only briefly, almost shyly, before being subsumed into a larger project name. In railroad records, it shows up under a different description, folded into a batch of acquisitions lumped together for efficiency. In what little remains of the Astor internal memoranda, the land is referenced obliquely, our position on the rural corridor, the matter of the contested parcel now resolved. The voices of the original owners, the local officials who hesitated, the silent witnesses who watched the stakes go in and the rails arrive, are largely erased. They survive only as gaps, an unexplained delay, a meeting that leaves no minutes, a payment that passes through an intermediary with no obvious reason to be involved. If you've ever wondered how a dark legacy like this can stay hidden in plain sight, this is how. Not through a single dramatic concealment, but through countless small absences carefully aligned. When you stand inside a modern reading room handling these fragments with cotton gloves, it doesn't feel like a simple legal story. It feels like walking through a forbidden room created out of paper and ink, a place where hidden heirs and silent witnesses have been pushed just out of frame. There is the smell of old bindings when a volume is opened, the soft thud as a heavy book is set down, the almost imperceptible hesitation of the archivist as they decide how much context to offer. You notice that one contract has been recopied in a different hand, with a date that is just slightly off. You notice that a bundle of correspondence is bound with newer twine than the box that holds it, as if it had been removed and reassembled at some later, more anxious time. You start to wonder not just what was written, but who decided what would survive. The more you trace the trajectory of these lands, the clearer it becomes that the farm in question was never only about a single family conflict. It formed part of a coordinated effort in which multiple elite figures, railroad directors, financiers, political patrons, used property as a way to weave an invisible net around public infrastructure decisions. The government obtained land, the railroad expanded, and the Astors preserved their image as benevolent landlords while participating in a scheme that quietly sidelined both transparency and fairness. The price of protecting that legacy was borne by those whose names do not appear in the genealogies or the society columns, the ones whose resistance was reduced to a smudge of ink or a line crossed out. At some point, in some office above the noise of the city streets, a set of architectural drawings is unrolled to reflect the completed project. The tracks are drawn as thin, confident lines. Adjacent lots are labeled with tidy script. In the lower corner, a draft version of the plan shows an access structure, a small service building, marked with a door that would have opened directly onto what was once the heart of the farm. In the official final blueprint filed for posterity, that building is still there. A simple rectangle sketched in blue, but the door has been carefully erased, leaving a stretch of blank wall where an opening should be. No annotation explains the change, no note records who ordered it. And somewhere, between the missing doorway on the plan and the silence in the records, the weight of what really happened settles over the page like a quiet that has lasted for generations and is suddenly, uneasily, starting to crack. If you stand in that erased doorway on the blueprint long enough, your eyes eventually lift from the missing line of ink to the city itself, to the place where stories were supposed to be recorded, the newsroom. In the Gilded Age, newsrooms weren't yet the romantic, noisy temples of noble truth we imagine. They were cramped floors above printing presses, air thick with ink and coal. Dust, where the cost of paper and the moods of publishers mattered more than any lone reporter's conscience. Metal type rattled in trays, boys darted between desks with proofs still warm from the press, and on every table lay the same invisible weight, the unspoken understanding that some names lived above criticism. The Astors were among those names. Editors didn't need explicit orders to understand that a scandal involving the Astor family and a questionable land deal along a railroad line was not a story to chase. The rules traveled in smaller gestures, a publisher's hand resting for a moment on the edge of an editor's desk, the pause before a question. Do we have anything solid on that rural matter? No? Then leave the speculation to the local gossip sheets. A polite laugh at a club when someone hinted that a certain farm had changed hands too quickly. A quiet reminder over cigars that the paper's lease on its building depended on the goodwill of landowners whose names appeared in the society pages every Sunday. These are the moments when Golden Age secrets were preserved, not in locked safes, but in nods and silences exchanged between men who understood how fragile their own positions could be. If you leaf through bound volumes of big city papers from those years, you'll find columns of type celebrating progress, new tracks laid, grand openings of stations, public officials cutting ribbons under bunting. The language is triumphant, almost rehearsed. Somewhere off the page, though, another story is trying to form. A reporter hears about a farmer pushed off land along the future route, about lawyers who arrive unannounced, about prices that don't match the whispers in the tavern. He mentions it to his editor, fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the desk, eyes flicking toward a map pinned crookedly to the wall. The editor listens, then glances at the advertising ledger open beside him. Columns of promised revenue from railroad companies, notices for rental, properties in Astor-owned buildings, sponsors whose names thread through the city like invisible rail lines of their own. The editor's answer isn't a shouted no. It's a small exhale, a hand laid flat on the ledger, and a suggestion to focus on the human interest angle at the station opening instead. Over time, this sort of decision-making becomes habit. A journalist who pushes too hard on such stories finds assignments thinning out. Invitations to important dinners stop coming. A whispered remark in a publisher's ear that this reporter is reckless, too fond of rumors, a poor fit for a modern, respectable paper, can be enough to send him to a smaller town or out of journalism altogether. The price of protecting a dark legacy is rarely paid by the family whose name adorns mansions and library wings. It's paid in small increments by the people at the edge of the story, the silent witnesses whose careers and voices can be erased without a headline, and as they disappear, the official record grows smoother, more flattering, more incomplete. Letters that do survive from the business side of these papers are careful, but not entirely clean. A publisher thanks a railroad director for continued partnership and mentions in the same paragraph our recent understanding about avoiding unnecessary alarm over rural acquisition matters. Another note scribbled in the margin of an advertising contract reads, "They would appreciate a more favorable tone regarding more expansion, no talk of displacement." Such phrases don't sound like threats, they sound like negotiations. Yet behind them lies a simple equation: coverage in exchange for access, silence in exchange for stability. When a family like the Astors stands at one end of that equation, the scales are never in doubt. In smaller newspapers closer to the farm, hints appear and then vanish. A brief item about local resistance to land transfers runs once and is never followed up. A columnist alludes to heavy-handed tactics from unnamed city interests, and then, in the next issue, writes a cheerful piece about visiting a new urban hotel financed by the same group. If you compare editions, you can sometimes see the seams. A paragraph that has been set in slightly different type, an awkward jump from one topic to another where a more critical line might have been cut. These tiny scars in the layout are the fingerprints of erased records, the visible edges of stories that almost emerged. The fear of destroying reputations isn't only about the families involved, it's also about the institutions that depend on them. A scandal implicating the Astors in corrupt land deals wouldn't just tarnish one name. It would call into question the purity of philanthropy that funded libraries, hospitals, and cultural institutions. If the money that built a reading room came in part from coerced sales of farmland along a railroad, what did that say about the moral foundation of the city's most admired spaces. People who had dedicated their lives to those institutions might hesitate to look too closely, not because they approved of corruption, but because they dreaded the collapse that exposing it could trigger. The price of protecting a legacy can feel, in the moment, like the price of protecting an entire social order. From the perspective of Beyond the Golden Halls, this is where the story brushes up against forbidden rooms that aren't made of stone, but of paper. A Gilded Age newsroom can be its own hidden wing, a place where certain subjects are never brought to the table, where hidden heirs to the truth are quietly turned away at the door. The reporters who could have given voice to the dispossessed become silent witnesses instead, their notes destroyed, their drafts never set in type. The public, reading each morning about charity balls and groundbreaking ceremonies, never sees the missing columns that were never written, the empty spaces where a different version of events might have appeared. Decades later, when you sit at a wooden table in an archive turning pages that once passed through those newsrooms, the silence is almost louder than any sensational headline would have been. You find entire weeks where every major development is covered: stock prices, political speeches, society weddings, yet nothing mentions the sudden flurry of land transfers along the very corridor where the railroad was being planned. You come across an internal memo from a newspaper. Executive, preserved by accident in a personal collection, referring to unproductive inquiries into private estates, and recommending a more constructive focus on the positive aspects of expansion. The language is polite, but the shadow it casts is long. There is one particular artifact that makes the silence tangible. In a box of old printing room materials, misfiled under miscellaneous proofs, lies a sheet of newsprint that was never run. It carries a partial layout for a city page, columns of text about commercial growth, a small illustration of a locomotive, a brief police report about a brawl in a tavern near the tracks. At the center of the page, outlined by faint blue pencil, there is a rectangular space where a headline and story should be. The framing lines are there, the boundaries set, but the type never came. Someone, at some point between planning and printing, decided that this space would remain blank. On the reverse side, faint and backward, you can just make out a few ghost letters from an earlier impression, enough to suggest that a different story once occupied that rectangle, a story that included the word farm and the name of the county where our disputed land lies. The letters are too incomplete to read, like a face in an old photograph that has been rubbed almost smooth, and in that worn patch of paper, the quiet of all those missing reports gathers and waits. If you walk back from that blank rectangle of newsprint and through the streets to an Astor townhouse in the late Gilded Age, the silence around the farm begins to sound less like an accident and more like a decision made behind heavy doors. Upstairs, away from the murmur of servants and the clatter of silver in the dining room, there is a smaller room where the family doesn't pose for portraits or entertain guests. It smells of varnished wood and stale cigar smoke, and the windows are half covered by heavy drapes that turn daylight into something muted and cautious. This is where the real conversation about land, inheritance, and control takes place. On the table, there are no framed photographs, only ledgers with ribbon bookmarks, stacks of correspondence tied in careful bundles, and a single crystal decanter that catches what little light is allowed into the room. Around it gather not the whole Astor clan, but a narrow circle, the relatives who understand that the future of the fortune will be decided as much by what is kept off the books as by what appears in the will. The gestures in this room are not the grand theatrical ones seen in society balls. They are smaller, more revealing. A hand resting for a fraction too long on a particular ledger. A sideways glance when the name of a younger cousin is mentioned. The quiet closing of a door just as the discussion shifts from general assets to problematic parcels. The farm in these conversations is never called by its local name. It is the rural matter, the corridor holding, the piece adjacent to the rail interest. A family member who owns only a minor share is described as sentimental, unreliable, unsuited to the responsibilities of modern property management. On the surface, this is just the language of efficient administration in a rapidly changing America. Underneath it is the vocabulary of a conspiracy, the moment when blood ties begin to bend around money, and the map of loyalty inside the family no longer matches the map of the estate. The Gilded Age loved to present itself as a time of clear hierarchies, patriarchs at the top, obedient heirs in line, fortunes flowing cleanly down the generations. But when you examine internal financial reports that survive by accident, drafts stuffed into the wrong envelope, duplicates never burned, you see a different picture. You find one Astor uncle quietly aligning with a railroad director through a private investment club, using that relationship to argue that the farm sale must be handled with discretion for the sake of long-term cohesion. You find a cousin sitting on the board of a trust company that mysteriously acquires temporary title to the land before passing it along. You see a pattern of allied names recurring in minutes of meetings. The same lawyers, the same bankers, the same advisors, whose job seems less about counsel and more about ensuring that certain branches of the family receive less than others. These are the hidden heirs of influence, people with no place in the official family tree who, nonetheless, shape the way roots and branches are pruned. Somewhere on the margins of those same documents, faint pencil notes tell the other half of the story. Next to one proposed division of property, a clerk has written, "Objection from Miss A," not recorded in minutes. In the margin of another page, there is a crossed-out sentence about difficulties with the junior line and a replacement phrase about successful resolution of concerns. The difference between those two versions is the space where resentment begins. Younger relatives, already accustomed to seeing decisions finalized before they are consulted, start to notice that certain assets always move in one direction, toward the allies of the inner circle, away from those who are merely expected to smile in family portraits. A promised share becomes a necessary adjustment. A once discussed parcel of land becomes no longer available for distribution. In a world already built on Golden Age secrets, this is another layer. Not just the public being kept from the truth, but entire branches of the family being turned into silent witnesses inside their own lineage. The habits of the elite American families make this kind of encobramento almost natural. Dissent is handled privately, behind closed doors, with the soft slam of a carriage door instead of the loud crack of scandal. A relative who questions the handling of the farm is gradually invited to fewer dinners. A young man who protests too much is sent abroad for his health, ostensibly to study or tour Europe, conveniently far from the meetings where the final terms of the land transfer are inked. A woman who expresses concern in a letter to a trustee finds her correspondence answered with polite, empty reassurances, while the real decisions move forward without her knowledge. The logic of succession is recited like a prayer: primogeniture, stability, preservation of the name. Yet the reality is that alliances with outside partners now matter more than the feelings of those born into the family. This is the kind of dynamic that produces dark legacy without a single dramatic betrayal. Instead, it unfolds in increments. A signature obtained under pressure here, a codicil to a will added there, a trust quietly altered for tax reasons that just happens to remove a disputed parcel from the pool of assets to be divided. The internal reports that map this process read at first glance, like any other financial summary: columns of numbers, dates, interest rates. But if you trace the lines across multiple years, you see how the farm that should have been part of a shared inheritance is gradually isolated, siphoned into special vehicles controlled by the same tight circle allied with railroad interests. Those who benefit learn to speak about protecting the family, ensuring continuity, avoiding unnecessary fragmentation. Those who lose out are left with stories that rarely leave the drawing room, their anger folded into anecdotes and whispers rather than court cases. When you, standing a century later in an archive, come across a handwritten note from a disfavored relative, the emotional temperature of the room changes even if no one else is there. The handwriting is smaller, more cramped than the confident signatures on the official documents. The ink has faded unevenly, as if the page lay in a drawer where the light only reached it at certain times of day. In a few tight paragraphs, this person describes learning that the farm has been reassigned and that their expected portion has become for the general good, a phrase that appears nowhere in the legal agreements but seems to echo through family conversations. The letter does not threaten scandal. It asks questions that are never answered, about fairness, about promises remembered differently by those who made them and those who relied on them. It is a piece of testimony that was never meant for public view, yet here it is, a crack in the polished facade of the Astor narrative. Faced with information like this, with evidence that the Golden Age grandeur stood partly on erased records and carefully excluded voices, would you speak and risk being cast out of the hall? Or would you stay silent and keep your place at the table? Beyond the golden halls lives in that hesitation, in that tiny pause before loyalty and conscience choose a direction. The conspiracy inside the Astor family is not a single meeting or a single signature. It is a web of choices, made over years. Choices that placed strategic partnerships and control of land above the bonds of blood. Hidden heirs to grievances walk through those mansions like ghosts, their names appearing only in side notes, their faces present in group portraits but missing from the ledgers that decide where the money flows. The forbidden rooms in this story are not only sealed attics or locked wings, but entire chapters of the family's financial life, kept out of the official histories written for. Public consumption. Each withheld inheritance, each manipulated division of property, deepens the resentment that settles into the family like dust. Too fine to notice at first, impossible to remove completely once it has settled into every crack. There is, in one photo album from the era, a detail that fixes this dark legacy in a single image. The album itself is heavy, bound in leather, the kind of object displayed in a parlor to prove the solidity of a lineage. Between pages of carefully mounted cabinet cards, Astor children in stiff collars, elders in formal dress, group images taken on the steps of townhouses and summer estates, there is a gap where a photograph has clearly been removed. The corners of the page still show the faint triangles of old adhesive. And in the center, where the image once was, a pale rectangle interrupts the sepia tones around it. On the facing page, beneath a surviving portrait labeled simply, Family Gathering Newport, one name in the handwritten. Caption has been scratched out with such deliberate pressure that the paper fibers have lifted, leaving a rough white scar where ink used to lie. No one added a replacement. No one wrote in who stood between those cousins in that moment. The room in the background is perfectly clear, chandeliers, gilded frames, polished floor, while the absent name sits above it like a door that was slammed shut and then painted over, its outline still visible to anyone willing to look long enough at the damage. By the time the quarrels inside the Astor townhouse had hardened into decisions, the real movement of the farm had already started somewhere else, on the upper floors of railroad headquarters, in rooms that shook faintly when locomotives rolled past outside. While clerks downstairs shouted over the roar of presses and telegraph keys, a different kind of conversation unfolded behind doors padded just enough to muffle the noise. Here, in the late Gilded Age, the men who called themselves directors and presidents met under high ceilings, stained by cigar smoke, their jackets cut from the same dark cloth as the city's bankers, their eyes drawn over and over again to the same thing. Maps. On the walls, on the tables, pinned to boards and rolled into tubes, the country lay spread out in pencil and ink. Lines of tracks sliced across it like fresh scars, converging where profit and power dictated. Somewhere along one of those pale, wavering paths, the Astor farm was nothing more than a small rectangle marked with a number, a detail to be shifted into position without ever being named aloud. Railroad men in this era understood land the way a card sharper understands a deck. A farm wasn't a home, it was a pivot point. A curve in the route wasn't an accident, it was a negotiation. When they spoke of acquisitions, they rarely mentioned owners, only obstacles, holdouts, essential parcels. On evenings when the board convened, Boots left faint tracks of soot on the marble floors. Glasses clinked softly as someone traced with a fingertip the stretch of countryside that would soon rattle beneath steel wheels. A secretary stood just inside the door, notebook open, eyes on the floor, trained to record only the phrases meant to survive. Our friends in New York have expressed willingness. The estate is prepared to cooperate off the record. Government authorization will follow once we have secured the necessary private understanding. That last phrase, the necessary private understanding, never appeared in the official minutes, but it hovered in the space between what was said and what was written down. The Astors fit neatly into this pattern. To a railroad president whose name is now invoked when people talk about robber barons, the family was both counterpart and mirror. They owned property where tracks needed to run, and they controlled influence where newspapers and politicians could cause trouble. The farm, as part of a larger web of Astor holdings, offered an opportunity that went far beyond its fields and hedgerows. In one surviving memorandum, a railroad attorney notes that alignment with interests on the rural corridor will secure favorable consideration on terminal rights in the city. The language is dry, but the implication is not. In exchange for smoothing the way through the countryside, making sure that difficult owners did not block the line, the company could expect more generous terms where land was truly priceless. Urban. Space that future generations would cross without ever knowing what had been traded for their convenience. Some of these arrangements were never written as contracts at all. They lived in the pauses between formal meetings and the corridors outside private clubs. A railroad executive, shrugging on his coat in the glow of gas lamps, might murmur to an Astor representative that the local matter will be resolved discreetly. A gloved hand might rest briefly on the banister, a nod exchanged at the mention of a particular county. The details would be handled by intermediaries, a small law firm in Albany, a trust company that appeared suddenly in the chain of title and disappeared again after a season. When you trace those entities in the records, you see the same surnames recurring, sometimes as signatories, sometimes simply as witnesses, always close enough to see the ink dry, never close enough to be blamed when the stories of coercion began to circulate among farmers and town officials. For families like the Astors and the men running the railroads, this collaboration was the logical outcome of a shared worldview. They believed in progress, as long as it flowed along lines they drew themselves. They believed in the rule of law, as long as the law could be interpreted by attorneys who understood the value of a strategic omission. When a contract did need to exist, when the government required documentation of land transfers for rights of way, the language was polished until it gleamed. On the surface, it described voluntary sales, fair compensation, mutual benefit. Only in the attachments, in the handwritten notes and side letters now scattered through archives, do you find hints of what was kept off the official page. Promises of favorable freight rates, quiet commitments to steer business through certain banks, assurances that any local unpleasantness would be addressed through means not specified. For the families whose land lay in the path of this machinery, the consequences were not abstract. A farmer who had expected to pass the property to a son might wake to find strangers at his gate, their boots leaving clean marks on the frost as they crossed the yard. They carried rolled documents and spoke a mixture of legal technicalities and vague threats. Delays in compensation if he refused, questions about tax arrears that might suddenly become urgent, whispers that the government would take the land anyway, with less generosity if he did not cooperate. His hesitation might be noted, but only in the private correspondence of agents who later described him as unreasonable or ill-informed. When the deed was finally signed, the text recorded only his consent, not the long pause before his name met the paper, not the way his hand tightened around the pen as if he knew he was watching his future leave the room. The dark legacy of this Gilded Age system is written not only in the fortunes built, but in the erased records left behind. In railroad archives, you find a ledger where one column lists payments for land acquisition, and another, narrower column, written in a different hand, details miscellaneous considerations. The amounts in that second column never appear in the company's published reports. In some cases, those entries are later crossed out in a heavy line, leaving only a faint ridge where the ink used to be, as if the paper itself remembers a sum that someone no longer wanted to see. On the Astor side, you see parallel patterns, internal memoranda referring to anticipated informal returns, future accommodations, and support to be reciprocated via city channels. The words are cautious, but the structure is clear. A web of obligations binding mansions to boardrooms, hidden heirs to influence walking through forbidden rooms made of ledgers and maps. Decades later, when the trains have become background noise and the names of the robber barons adorn university halls, the human impact of these agreements lingers in quieter places. A family in the countryside tells stories of a great-grandparent forced off the land, but they no longer know which railroad or which estate was responsible. A town's layout makes little sense unless you understand that it grew around tracks laid where they did not have to go, chosen not for the convenience of the people who would live there, but for the convenience of men who read maps like balance sheets. In city archives, a clerk filing away new paperwork might notice that certain older boxes, those linked to early railroad expansions and prominent estates, arrive with their strings tied a little too tightly, their inventories written a little too vaguely. The Golden Age secrets embedded in them have outlived the men who made the deals, becoming part of the landscape in the same way the rails themselves did. From the vantage point of beyond the Golden Halls, the role of the railroads in the Astor farm story is not just a backdrop, it is a key to understanding how power maintained itself almost effortlessly. The companies provided the machinery, the families provided the land and the social cover, and together they learned how to turn public progress into private wealth while leaving almost no trace of their quiet agreements. Hidden heirs to the truth of these deals still exist, in half-remembered family stories, in misfiled depositions, in the occasional letter from a junior clerk who dared to be too precise. Silent witnesses walk beside us in the archives, their voices trapped in the gaps between documents, in the oddity of a route that bends for no obvious geographical reason, in an acquisition that happened too quickly to be entirely clean. In one railroad collection, in a gray box that was never meant to be remarkable, there is an object that makes all of this suddenly tangible. It is a folded route map, drawn on thin, brittle paper, edges darkened by the oils of hands long gone. On the outside, in neat ink, someone has written only a date and the name of the line. Inside, however, along the section that crosses the county where the Astor farm once lay, there are two lines. One is the route that appears in all the official filings and public announcements, skirting the old property by just enough to make the transfer look incidental. The other, drawn in faint pencil, runs straight through the heart of the farm, labeled with a single word in the margin, original. At some point, a hand tried to erase that penciled line, leaving smudges across the fields and a faint, stubborn trace of graphite where the tracks were first meant to go. When the map is returned to its envelope, the erased line disappears from view, but the pressure marks remain in the paper, a quiet physical contradiction of the version of events the world was given. And in that thin indentation, the weight of everything unsaid settles down and waits. By the time the rails were humming over land that had once been called a farm and now existed only as a number in company books, the real heart of the Astor story had retreated indoors, into a room where the air smelled of ink, beeswax, and old decisions, the room where the will lay. In the Gilded Age, a testament was not simply a list of bequests. It was the final architecture of power, the last blueprint of who belonged inside the Golden Age secrets and who would be left outside, standing on the steps. John Jacob Astor II understood that better than anyone. On certain afternoons, the house fell unnaturally quiet as a carriage drew up with a familiar livery and a lawyer stepped down, brushing road dust from his coat before being led upstairs. The staff recognized the pattern without being told. Doors were shut softly along the corridor. Conversations in the service hall faded to whispers. At the end of that hushed passage, behind a door that never appeared on any guest tour, The testator and his advisors gathered around a table cleared of everything but a blotter, a heavy silver inkwell, and a document whose edges had already begun to soften from being handled too often. The will had been written years earlier, in the confident script of a man certain of his line of succession. But the world beyond the windows had shifted. Railroads, new fortunes, fractures inside the family itself. The farm, the scandal, and those who had been inconveniently close to it now pressed against the clean lines of that original text like shadows behind frosted glass. The process of altering a will in that world was both public and secret. On paper, each change, each codicil, was a formal, legal act, witnessed and notarized. But the reasons for those changes lived in the spaces between signatures. The lawyer, spectacles low on his nose, would clear his throat before reading aloud a revised clause about the disposition of rural holdings, or the adjustment of certain provisions concerning collateral lines. His voice stayed even, but his eyes flicked up at key words, measuring the quiet reaction across the table. Astor's hand might hover for a fraction of a second above the page before committing another flourish of ink, the nib leaving a tiny tremor at the end of his name where the pen had paused mid-air. Somewhere, on another floor or in another city, someone like Amalia, once assured of a place in the distribution, or at least never explicitly erased, would feel the consequences of that pause years later without ever knowing when, exactly, she had slipped from inclusion into absence. Hidden heirs in the Gilded Age were not always illegitimate children in melodramatic novels. Sometimes they were fully acknowledged relatives quietly written around rather than written in. If you trace the versions of the testament that survive, the pattern becomes clearer with each revision. Early drafts speak broadly of all issue and collateral descendants, language that suggests a confidence that the fortune is large enough to encompass every branch of the family tree. Later versions grow more precise and more narrow. One clause that once read, "To be divided among such of my relatives as shall be living at my decease," acquires a new phrase, added in a different ink, "Save those whose interests have been otherwise provided for, as recorded in separate instruments." On the surface, this sounds generous, even protective. Only in the cross-reference, separate instruments, do you find the gap where exclusion can hide. Those instruments, if they ever existed in complete form, have not survived. What remains are hints. A note about a trust discussed but never established. A ledger entry for a temporary provision in favor of someone whose name later appears only in the minutes of a meeting about how to resolve complications arising from the rural acquisition. The dark legacy of the farm has seeped into the testament itself, turning inheritance into another forbidden room where certain footsteps are never heard again. Amalia's presence in this web is most visible in her disappearance. In one annotated copy of the will, discovered in a packet of papers tied with discolored ribbon, her name appears briefly in the margin next to a clause about distant relations residing away from the city. A slender line leads from the clause to the margin, where her name is written in a neat feminine hand, as if someone reading expected that this is where she belonged. Beside it, in sharper, more decisive script, another hand has written a single word, omitted. The ink of that correction is darker than the surrounding text, as if the pen had been dipped with particular care. There is no explanation, no justification, just that one word, the smallest of edits performing the largest of erasures. For the lawyers, this is efficiency. For the family, it is control. For Amalia, it is a future redirected without her knowledge. The farm and the hush around it folded into a decision she never sits at the table to hear. This is where the law becomes less a neutral framework and more an instrument shaped by those who can afford to test its limits. The logic of succession, repeated in pamphlets and polite conversation, insists that such fortunes must be preserved intact, that fragmentation would invite chaos, that hard choices are necessary to safeguard the legacy. Yet when you look at who is cut out and when, the lines align too neatly with the timing of scandals and the geography of embarrassment. Those who were closest to the questionable deals, or who might ask the wrong questions about the trajectory of certain lands, find themselves described in internal notes as unsuitable for further responsibility or already adequately supported through prior assistance. The will, as read in court, presents a picture of foresight and prudence. The will, as glimpsed in drafts and side letters tucked into envelopes marked private, shows something else. A man using the full weight of the law to ensure that the story of his wealth and of the farm that helped secure it will be told only in one voice. In the archives where these papers now rest, the atmosphere around the testament files feels different from that around ordinary contracts. The boxes are heavier, the folders thicker, the handwriting older and more formal. When you open a file, the pages exhale the faint scent of leather bindings and long-closed rooms. You see the original will, its opening lines framed with flourishes, the word last in last will, and testament underlined with quiet emphasis. Behind it, like shadows layered over the same image, are the codicils, each marked with a date and a careful notation of witnesses. Some bear creases that have nothing to do with legal use, folds made by hands that carried these pages into conversations too delicate for the record. A late-night discussion with a trusted advisor, a tense exchange across a library table while a clock ticked loudly in the corner. The testimonies of those moments are gone. Their only trace is the way the paper curves where it shouldn't, a physical memory of being held while someone weighed loyalty against the pull of a darker, safer choice. For a channel like Beyond the Golden Halls, this is the core of the Gilded Age paradox. The same document that preserves the outline of a fortune also maps its silences. The will is supposed to be final, complete, the last word of a patriarch whose name still lingers on buildings and institutions. Yet the more you examine it, the more you see the fingerprints of fear, fear of scandal, fear of fractured control, fear of what might happen if someone like Amalia were left with enough leverage to reopen questions everyone else has agreed to bury. These fears are never stated outright. They live in the little changes, the tightened phrasing, the sudden introduction of phrases like, "to my satisfaction," and "subject to my absolute discretion." They live in the knowledge that by the time anyone outside that room reads these lines, the author will be beyond cross-examination, and the silent witnesses who saw the farm pass from one hand to another will be scattered, their voices reduced to rumors and faint pencil notes in the margins of other people's files. Among the papers connected to the will, there is one object that holds all of this in a single, unnervingly quiet image. It is a small, oval portrait on cardstock, the kind that would once have been tucked into an album or propped on a mantelpiece. The sitter's clothes, from what remains, mark her as someone from the outer circle of a wealthy family, respectable, well-tailored, but without the extravagant jewelry of the main line. The name written in a looping script beneath the image has been scratched out so thoroughly that the surface of the card is frayed, a shallow crater where ink and paper once met. Only the first letter is still clear, an elegant A that could stand for many things, but that whispers Amalia to anyone who has been following. The threads. The face itself has been carefully abraded away, not torn or blotted, but rubbed with something rough until the features dissolved, leaving a pale, oval void framed by still perfect curls of hair and the high collar of a dress. Behind her, the photographer's painted backdrop shows a column, a curtain, the faint hint of a distant landscape. Everything that was meant to be permanent is intact. Only the person has been removed. And in that blank oval, hovering above a name that no longer exists on the card, the silence of what the testament truly did and whom it chose to forget, hangs in the air like dust in a room no one admits was ever locked. The fire was set with a calm deliberation, the kind of precision that only those accustomed to making uncomfortable truths disappear could manage. It wasn't the kind of blaze that roared and crackled, one that would demand attention. No, this fire was quiet, controlled, tucked in the back of a small office where papers were burned, before the eyes of those who had been told not to ask questions. The smoke didn't reach the windows, and the burn marks on the floor could be easily explained away by a careless hand with a match. No one ever questioned how quickly certain documents vanished from the Astor archives. After all, in the Gilded Age, wealth had a way of making history seem like a private affair, one that could be written or erased at will. But the truth, hidden in the small details, an anxious glance, the rustling of paper thrown quickly into the flames, was that the destruction of records was not an accident. It was the final act of silencing the past. When you walk through the Astor mansion, you can feel the weight of it in the silence between the grand rooms, the spaces where nothing is allowed to linger. In the late afternoons when the house seemed almost empty, a visitor might have noticed the careful arrangement of ledgers, bound volumes of legal notes and contracts, all sitting on polished tables that gleamed under the gaslight. But what they wouldn't have seen were the papers that didn't make it to those tables, the ones hidden under the floorboards or tucked away in sealed rooms, far from prying eyes. The destruction of these documents wasn't just a practical matter, it was an art that had been perfected over decades of wealth and power, where the few who had the most had learned how to control what remained of their stories. On the surface, nothing about the Astor records would seem out of place. They were filled with names, dates, and formal agreements, much like any other estate document. But it wasn't the signed contracts or the formal letters that made the most noise. It was the gaps, the missing contracts where once there had been a name, the void where an agreement had once been outlined in ink, now covered over by a series of notes that could not be easily explained. Those who kept the records had learned a simple trick. If the story was dangerous, simply erase it, or, better yet, burn it before anyone could question what had been left out. The legal agreements surrounding the farm, the land once part of the Grand Astor holdings, were no exception. Correspondence about the railroad acquisition, the negotiations between the family and the railroad magnates, all of it was there, filed neatly in chronological order. But somewhere in the process, something went wrong. Perhaps it was a momentary lapse, a piece of paper left unattended on a desk, or a conversation that was overheard in the wrong place. A few key names, those who had too much to lose if the truth got out, were quietly excluded from the narrative of ownership. And so, when the documents were safely in the hands of those who controlled the estate's future, the only logical conclusion was to ensure that any record of the farm's true history was obliterated. Legal papers were carefully shredded, letters marked for destruction, and when the fire was set to the documents that had been deemed inconvenient, it was clear that those who were responsible for overseeing the Astor legacy had learned the value of selective memory. Those who had once been involved in the transactions found their names gone from the ledger, replaced by others whose connections to the family were far more secure, far more acceptable. The shift in the family's legal handling of land wasn't just about ownership, it was about preserving a public image, one that had to remain untainted by any hint of scandal or corruption. For the Astors, protecting their image wasn't just a matter of reputation, it was a matter of survival, ensuring that the wealth and power passed down through the generations would remain unquestioned. But the destruction of records was more than a tactic for covering up a single scandal. It was a necessary move to protect a larger structure, a system of influence that stretched far beyond the family's land and reached deep into the veins of New York society, into the boardrooms of the most powerful banks, and into the very heart of the political machine. In an age when fortunes could be made or broken with the stroke of a pen, erasing inconvenient truths was just another part of the game. When a deal was struck, the family could afford to lose some land, but they could never afford to lose their hold over the narrative, the ability to shape history as it was being written. The lawyers and advisors who participated in these secretive acts never thought they were doing anything unusual. In their world, manipulating the past wasn't a crime. It was simply the way business was done. The instructions to remove all copies and ensure no public record survives were part of their standard procedure. Even the destruction of documents that could have proved key to understanding the Astor dealings in the railroad acquisitions was framed as a necessity. The trust had to be preserved after all. The family's future, their continued control, depended on keeping the full truth of their business dealings buried deep under layers of legalese and burned papers. But when you start digging into the scattered remnants of those destroyed files, when you open drawers that have been sealed for too long, you begin to see the faintest traces of what was meant to disappear. It's in the gaps between sentences in the surviving correspondence, in the curious footnotes on old legal papers that refer to documents now lost or details never recorded. These fragmented hints are like small fissures in a grand facade, waiting for someone to peer through. If you know where to look, you can see the edges of the truth, a truth that was carefully erased but never fully eradicated. And then there's the fire that wiped away so much but not everything. A ledger from that time still survives, unscathed, its pages turning slowly in the cold air of an archive room. It contains a note, barely visible, written in faint ink, reading, "Burnt documents, replaced per instructions. No further copies made." The words are neutral, even bureaucratic, but in them lies the story of everything that was almost lost. The finality of that note, the absolute certainty with which the order was carried out, shows how far the Astor family and their allies were willing to go to bury what they knew was dangerous. And what if, somewhere in the ashes of those destroyed papers, there is something else? A single overlooked document that should have burned along with the rest, but somehow, miraculously, survived. An agreement, a letter, a piece of correspondence that ties everything together. It's impossible to know for certain, but what is certain is this: the destruction was never just about covering one scandal. It was about keeping a powerful, dangerous secret buried, preserving the illusion of control for those at the top. Imagine finding that letter. What would you do? Would you expose the darkness buried in the ashes of a gilded empire? Or would you leave it behind, knowing the consequences of speaking the truth? In a sealed drawer, behind walls that have known only silence, lies something waiting, something not meant for anyone else's eyes. A final letter, perhaps, a piece of history unmarked by time. If you found it, what would you say? What would you do with the power to expose it after all these years? The towering mansions along Fifth Avenue, their facades adorned with glittering windows and carefully manicured gardens, stood as monuments to the Astor family's vast fortune. In those gilded rooms, beneath chandeliers that sparkled with the weight of history, the Astors held not only land but power, an empire woven into the fabric of New York City itself. But behind those polished walls, the cracks had begun to form long before the public ever noticed. The farm, once part of the family's rich heritage, had already been lost in the silent shuffle of ownerships and legal maneuverings. What had once been a symbol of their grandeur was now just another entry in the ledger of a dynasty slowly unraveling. The manipulation of land, wealth, and inheritance had allowed the Astors to maintain their grip on power for decades, but even the tightest webs unravel over time. Their empire was built on subtlety, deals struck behind closed doors, agreements sealed with a handshake, documents carefully altered or destroyed when inconvenient truths threatened to surface. The Astor family, despite their wealth and influence, was not immune to the forces of corruption that flowed beneath the surface of society's gleaming exterior. As they maneuvered to secure their position, they ignored the inevitable toll such manipulation would take, not just on the integrity of their holdings, but on their very legacy. For years, the Astors had thrived by controlling not just land but perception. They carefully curated their public image, using their wealth and connections to influence newspapers and suppress scandals. But the further they pushed the boundaries of what could be hidden, the more they exposed themselves to danger. As the empire grew, so did the resentment of those who had been left behind, excluded from the wealth and power that had once seemed destined for all corners of the family. The manipulation of their inheritance system, ensuring that certain members were excluded while others were given preferential treatment, began to fracture the family's unity, sowing the seeds of a slow, painful collapse. It wasn't just the exclusion of relatives that weakened the family. It was the realization that, in their pursuit of control, they had damaged the very thing that had made the Astor name synonymous with strength: trust. The Astors had played a dangerous game with their wealth, using it not only to build an empire, but to silence any dissent. Yet as the years passed, the very secrecy they had relied on began to erode the foundation of their power. The fortune that had once seemed unassailable became a gilded cage, trapping them in a world where appearances mattered more than reality. The vast network of legal agreements, contracts, and land deals that had been manipulated to protect the family's wealth now seemed more like a labyrinth than a legacy. And for every hidden clause, for every omitted name, the weight of guilt grew heavier. The fall was inevitable, but it came in stages, each one more subtle than the last. What was once a tightly held secret began to slip from the family's control. As the public became more aware of the Astors' behind-the-scenes machinations, cracks began to form in their carefully constructed image. Wealthy families of the Gilded Age were not immune to the rising tides of change. The very system they had used to maintain power, the manipulation of inheritance, the protection of secrets, the silencing of voices, was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain in a world that was beginning to demand transparency. Those who had been left out of the wealth pie, who had been excluded from the estate, now had a voice. Whispers spread through the upper echelons of society, and as they did, the Astors' carefully curated image of wealth and control began to crumble. There are few more telling symbols of the Astors' decline than their relationship with the very land that once defined them. The farm that had once been their pride, a symbol of their power and legacy, had become the focal point of everything that went wrong. Once a quiet piece of property nestled in the countryside, it now became the epitome of the family's struggles. What had once been an asset was now a liability, a piece of history that had been rewritten in the hands of those who wanted to hold onto power at all costs. As the family's empire crumbled, the story of the farm became the story of the Astors themselves, a tale of corruption, manipulation, and a stubborn refusal to acknowledge that the world around them was changing. Yet even as the family faltered, they still held on to their wealth, their properties, and their reputation. The fall was not sudden, but gradual, a slow erosion of everything they had built. Their control over New York's elite, over their properties, over the press, began to wane, and with it, so did their influence. As they fought to protect their legacy, they revealed just how fragile that legacy truly was. What had once been an empire built on land, wealth, and political influence had been undermined by the very methods they had used to secure it. The Astors were no longer the untouchable family they had once been, and their fall from grace was as inevitable as the passing of time. But there was something more lurking in the shadows of their decline. The legacy they fought so hard to protect, the fortune that had given them such immense power, was now at risk of being buried under the weight of the very secrets they had fought to keep hidden. In their desperation to secure control, they had forgotten one thing: the price of silence. The very actions they had taken to maintain their status had now become the chains that bound them. The manipulation of their legacy, the exclusion of certain family members, the destruction of records, all of it was starting to catch up with them. And yet, as the Astors began to lose their grip on the empire they had built, there were those who would stop at nothing to ensure that the family's secrets remained buried. The pressure to maintain the family's image, to preserve their reputation in the face of mounting scandal, only increased. Those in power were not ready to let go of their grip on history just yet. The family's decline, though inevitable, was far from over. In the shadow of the Astor downfall, a peculiar image lingers, a gilded mirror framed in ornate gold, reflecting a room that no longer exists, a room where the last of the Astors stand. In the reflection, a portrait hangs on the wall, its surface clouded, its face half erased, still visible but fading, just as the family's influence would soon do. The family that once commanded the city now found themselves ensnared in their own web of deception, desperately holding on to a legacy that had already begun to slip away. What would you do if you were left with the remnants of such a legacy? Would you defend it at all costs, or would you let it crumble, knowing that the price of power had already been paid long before the last signature was signed? As the last whispers of the Gilded Age faded into the early 20th century, a quiet war was being waged not in boardrooms or political halls, but in the forgotten corners of private homes, away from the press and public gaze. The grand estates, those grandiose symbols of wealth and success, became not only places of luxury, but of secrets. Places where the stories of the men and women who built America were carefully curated, and where the truths that didn't fit the ideal narrative were erased. Behind the grand facades, the story of the Astor family was no exception. For years, their name had been synonymous with power and influence, but beneath that polished veneer lay a scandal, a shadow cast by land deals that had been carefully swept under the rug, by manipulation that ensured the family's wealth stayed intact while others paid the price. In the years after the Astor farm was secretly relinquished and its true ownership obscured, the family's legacy became more than just wealth. It became a symbol of how history could be controlled, how the public narrative could be bent to suit the needs of those who held the power to write it. The very documents that could have exposed the manipulations, the letters, contracts, and ledgers, were slowly but surely destroyed or hidden. Every scrap of evidence that might suggest corruption or illegitimate land deals was carefully erased, as if the mere existence of such records would tarnish the image of one of the nation's most respected families. And as the years passed, the truth of what happened to the Astor fortune was buried under a mountain of lies, each one more carefully constructed than the last. But it wasn't just the Astor family that understood the power of erasure. The Gilded Age, for all its excess and spectacle, was also a time when the very concept of legacy was manipulated to protect those who had already secured their places at the top. The elite didn't just build empires, they built histories that suited their needs, histories that omitted the dark truths behind their rise. The Astors, like many families of the time, understood that controlling the story meant controlling the future. The destruction of records wasn't just about protecting their wealth, it was about ensuring that their place in history remained untarnished. As the years wore on, the story of the farm, once at the center of a powerful family's legacy, became nothing more than a whisper, a footnote in the history books, a rumor passed from one generation to the next. The estate, the farm, the land, all of it had been swept away, not with a bang, but with a slow, careful erasure. The family's public image remained intact, but the price for that perfection was the loss of the truth. The people who had once been involved, those who had known the secrets of the land, the deals made behind closed doors, were silenced, either through exclusion or through the quiet destruction of their own personal histories. The records were destroyed, the people were forgotten, and the family's fortune continued to grow, unhindered by the whispers that might have otherwise tainted it. But beneath the surface of this polished legacy, something remained, something that refused to be erased. The Astor family, though they succeeded in shaping their own version of history, could not entirely hide the damage they had done. The weight of those erased records lingered in the air, like the scent of a fire long extinguished, its smoke still visible in the corners of forgotten rooms. Those who understood what had happened, who had seen the land deals and the manipulations firsthand, carried the knowledge of what the family had done in the quietest of ways. And though their voices had been silenced, their memories of broken promises, of land stolen, of families displaced, remained. In the end, the family's legacy was not just one of wealth, it was one of concealment. The Astors had built their empire on a foundation of manipulation and secrecy, a foundation that had been so carefully crafted that, for a time, it seemed impenetrable. But the cost of that secrecy was great. As the family's fortunes grew, so did the fractures within. The more they erased, the more they silenced, the more the walls between them and the truth began to crumble. The story of the farm, the land, the power, it was never fully gone. It lived on, in the corners of archives, in the whispers of those who knew what had been lost, in the empty spaces where once there were records, the last piece of evidence, the last trace of what had truly happened. may have been buried beneath layers of lies and manipulation, but even the deepest secrets have a way of rising to the surface. As time moves on, the past always finds a way to claw its way back into the light. For all their wealth and power, for all their control over the narrative, the Astors could not entirely erase their past. And one day, the truth would emerge, even if it had to be pieced together from the fragments they had tried so hard to destroy. If you were to step into the room where the records had once been, you would find more than just empty shelves. You would find the remnants of a story, a legacy that had been carefully constructed and carefully hidden. The remnants of the past are never truly gone. They simply wait, like dust in the corners of an old mansion, to be uncovered once more. And now, as we sift through the ashes of what the Astors tried to bury, we must ask ourselves, what would we do if we found something like this? Something so carefully hidden, buried beneath the weight of decades of wealth and power? Would we look the other way, or would we bring the truth into the light no matter the cost? The choice, it seems, is still ours to make. And in that decision lies the final revelation. The truth, though buried, can never be entirely erased. The last echoes of the Astor Empire's grandeur whispered through the empty rooms of the mansion, through the faintest rustle of curtains drawn tight against the evening light. The family's once immense wealth, now spread thin like dust across the generations, began to fade into the obscurity of New York's Gilded Age past. Yet even in the waning years of their fortune, the Astors had learned well the art of survival. A survival that required not just wealth but silence, strategy, and above all, control. The scandal that had threatened to tear apart their carefully curated legacy, a scandal buried beneath layers of legal maneuvering, hidden documents, and erased records, had not brought their downfall. Not yet, at least. Instead, the family employed the oldest trick in the book. They adapted. They shifted their wealth, concealed it in foreign investments, and carefully redirected public attention. The gilded walls may have started to crack, but behind them, the machinery of Astor fortune continued to churn, albeit more discreetly. The public still saw their names on grand buildings, in elegant society pages, but those who knew where to look saw that the Astors had, in some sense, become ghosts in their own empire. Present enough to maintain a facade, but distant from the actual machinery of the wealth they had once flaunted. Despite everything, the land deals, the manipulation, the public scandal, the family survived because they understood one fundamental truth. The rules of the Gilded Age were never about fairness. They were about controlling the narrative. While lesser families fell victim to their own greed or mismanagement, the Astors, in their quiet resilience, maintained a grip on their power that extended far beyond their land holdings or New York's social scene. Their empire may have been faltering, but it wasn't gone. The elite didn't discard power. They redirected it, hid it, redefined it. And so, in time, they took a backseat, faded from the public eye, but never quite relinquished the influence they had so carefully curated. Behind the scenes, though, the family was beginning to feel the consequences of their own machinations. The cracks that had once seemed insignificant began to widen, and the deeper the fissures spread, the more apparent the price they had paid for their survival became. There were those who were long forgotten by the public, those silenced by the family's carefully arranged structure of power. Family members who had once been favored were now sidelined, excluded from the wealth they had been promised. New figures emerged from the shadows, men and women who had once stood at the periphery of the Astor world, now quietly absorbing the pieces of the empire that had once seemed beyond their reach. As new players moved into positions of power, the Astors, though still wealthy, found themselves relegated to a different kind of influence, one of behind-the-scenes control, where their names were invoked only in the hushed corridors of private clubs and boardrooms. Their fortune, now dispersed, could no longer hold its place at the forefront of the American elite. Still, their name lingered, too, powerful to be entirely erased, but too tarnished to maintain the same luster it once had. The final chapters of the Astor story became less about the lands they had once owned and more about the legacy they had carefully crafted, and then, inevitably, lost. But why had this story remained hidden for so long? Why had the truth behind the Astor legacy, behind the land deals and the familial betrayals, been kept so carefully sealed? The answer was simple. In a world built on wealth, power, and reputation, the Astors were not just heirs to land. They were heirs to something far more valuable: the ability to shape history itself. As the years wore on, their grip on the public narrative remained intact, their ability to erase uncomfortable truths still holding strong. The history of the Astors, after all, was not just their own. It was a history of the elite, of families who shaped the fabric of America while hiding their darker deeds behind polished curtains and closed doors. The Astors may have survived, but they did so by manipulating not just the law, but the very way their story was told. They understood the power of secrecy, the value of controlling the narrative, and how, with the right amount of influence, any scandal could be buried before it ever reached the public's eye. Their ability to erase records, to exclude heirs, to bury their misdeeds in private vaults. This was their true power, their real legacy. It was not the grand estates or the vast fortunes, but the quiet, subtle manipulation of history itself. And as the family's grip on the country's elite loosened, as the last remnants of their vast empire began to crumble, they left behind a powerful lesson. In the Gilded Age, it wasn't the wealth that determined a family's place in history. It was the ability to make sure no one ever questioned how they got it. The final remnants of the Astor legacy still echo through the silent halls of their former estates. The mansions may stand empty, the fields, once belonging to the family, now inhabited by strangers, but their story is far from over. In the corners of those forgotten rooms, hidden beneath layers of dust and old parchment, lies the truth of what they built and what they destroyed. And as more records emerge, as more secrets are uncovered, the story of the Astor's rise and fall continues to unravel, revealing a deeper mystery that not even time can erase. In the final analysis, the Astor's legacy is one of paradox. They were at once architects of one of the greatest fortunes in American history and manipulators of a history that never quite told the whole story. As more of their secrets emerge from the shadows, the question remains: who will ultimately control the story, and how much of the truth will be lost in the telling? Perhaps the only thing left of the Astor legacy that truly remains untouchable is the silence that surrounds it. The final chapter is still being written, and as with all stories of power and wealth, the question is not what happened, but what, if anything, will be left when it's finally uncovered. What else remains hidden, buried beneath layers of manipulation, waiting to be discovered? The last word on the Astor legacy has not yet been spoken, and when it is, the truth may be far darker than anyone could have anticipated. As we draw the curtains on this chapter of the Astor legacy, we find ourselves at a threshold, one where the shadows of the past still linger, stubborn and unyielding. Despite the light of discovery that slowly creeps through, the grand facades of their empire, now cracked and weathered by time, have not been entirely immune to the passage of history. The manipulation, the silencing, the destruction of records, these actions, so carefully orchestrated in dark corners of a gilded world, have not been erased, only buried beneath layers of dust and old paper. But the truth, like the faintest echo in a forgotten hallway, refuses to be entirely stilled. The family that once stood at the apex of New York society may have weathered their scandal, but the cost of their secrecy lingers, a heavy weight passed down the generations. They learned, as so many of the gilded elite did, that power is not only built on wealth, but on the careful shaping of narratives, the manipulation of what the public can see and what it must remain ignorant of. But as the walls of their carefully constructed world begin to crumble, so too does the very story they tried so hard to keep hidden. Each forgotten ledger, each discarded letter, And every erased name serves as a reminder of the lengths to which they went to preserve their legacy, and the lengths they went to bury what would have tarnished it. Yet, as we have seen, the story of the Astor family is not one that can be confined to the annals of history, sealed away in vaults or locked behind the heavy doors of private estates. The truth, though hidden, is persistent, emerging slowly like a faded portrait coming into focus as the dust settles. The Astors may have held their power for decades, but the very methods they employed to ensure their dominance are now the very mechanisms that threaten to unravel their history. The legacy of the Astor family, once so carefully manipulated, remains a powerful reminder of the fragility of dynasties. It tells us that those who control the wealth often also seek to control the truth, shaping not just what is seen, but what is remembered. In the halls of their forgotten estates, in the chambers where secrets were whispered behind closed doors, the echoes of their actions still reverberate. And though the final word has yet to be written, it seems that, in time, all secrets must find the light. If you find yourself drawn to the shadows where these truths lie hidden, to the forgotten corners where history waits to be uncovered, stay with us. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. If this story resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. And if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth. But as the walls begin to crack, the whispers grow louder, and the truth, at long last, begins to speak.